Hello and welcome to our telesummit on feminism as a sustainability tool. I'm Jenny Lamorgan, owner of greenwomanstore.com, where we enjoy creating educational tools like this telesummit on topics important to us as women. I'm excited to be here with our co-host, Carolyn Gage, to bring you experts on the topic of feminism with case studies from the U.S. and around the world. These two collective quests, feminism and sustainability, touch every aspect of our lives. Feminism has always brought hope and truth to whatever issue it touches, and we'll talk about the sustainability of feminism and the important role that feminism plays in a real, lasting, and global sustainability. Our goal is to bring you hope for the future and a reality that doesn't live in denial. And we can count on Carolyn Gage to facilitate these truths with clarity and grace. Carolyn is a lesbian feminist playwright, performer, director, and activist. She is the author of 12 books and more than 65 plays, musicals, and one-woman shows. She specializes in non-traditional roles for women and reclaims famous women's stories that have been distorted or erased from history. In 2014, Carolyn was one of only 6 featured playwrights at the 53rd Annual World Theater Day in Rome, sponsored by UNESCO. And now I'd like to introduce our guest today, Bonnie Morris. She is a professor, award-winning author, poet, and performer. Dr. Bonnie Morris is an author of 11 books, including Revenge of the Women's Studies Professor, also Eden Built by Eves, and Women's History for Beginners. Bonnie was the first graduate to complete American University's then new minor in women's studies. After earning her PhD, she taught one of the very first ever graduating seminars on Jewish women's history at Harvard. Professor Morris joined the Women's Studies faculty at George Washington University in 1994 and at Georgetown in 1996. She teaches women's Western civilization, gender and athletics, women and war, and introduction to women's studies. Each August, Bonnie lives in a tent for 2 weeks at the Michigan Women's Music Festival, where she coordinates the community center's crew and does a little impromptu poetry, which I've enjoyed. And Bonnie says, teaching women's history is my passion, and she'll talk with us about women's role in sustaining civilization. And now I turn it over to Carolyn. Enjoy these 2 performing authors. Welcome, Carolyn Gage.
Well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Dr. Bonnie Morris, for joining us.
Howdy.
For this. Well, this is going to be a great telesummit. I love the idea of feminism and sustainability, and you're just the person to kick it off, so welcome.
Thank you very much. I chimed in with this concept saying I believed that teaching women's history was a kind of sustainability, passing along the stories, most of which we still don't know, and I'm really proud to make that my life's work.
Yes, I kind of share that passion in the realm of theater. So I want to know when you find the time to write.
What a great question. And, you know, hardly anyone asks. It's just, it's such a delicious pleasure to be asked. Well, I have to say that changes in our world have allowed me to grab writing time during the day. Most of the students I work with communicate by email. I have lots and lots of office hours so that people can come in and go over their papers or chat about feminism, and they really don't do that very much. They prefer to contact me with questions through cyberspace. So I booked all of these hours where I'm available, and I use that as writing time, which means I've become, God forbid, a morning person. And I do a lot of writing and rewriting of stories and essays at 11 o'clock or at 1 o'clock or while I'm eating my lunch. My keyboard is filled with sandwich crumbs. It's just disgraceful. And because I do a whole lot of teaching, lecturing, leading discussions, standing on my feet in front of the classroom in the afternoons, when I get home at night, I really don't feel like working. And so instead of writing at home in the evening, I will take what I call a writing day or a writing weekend, and usually a Friday like today, or a Saturday or a Sunday, I'll plan around a specific chapter. But boy, during the teaching semester, I have really very little writing time, and there have been years where I was trying to finish a book while teaching 4 classes, and I would just be so stressed and tearing my hair out and probably snapping at people, and then I would have a really good writing day and feel on top of the world and happy. So, yeah, it's really not easy, and it's very difficult for my relatives to understand. You know, I know you understand this, that you have to go away from people and be alone, which seems very antisocial, and people love to, you know, support you if you're a writer and say, wow, that's great, but the part where you can't go out with them, or you're not available, or you want to be alone, it's hard for people to understand, and it's seen as very sinful if women detach to take artistic time alone, creative time.
Absolutely. I did it through disability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that was my secret. But yes, it is very difficult. And in my case, I found it difficult because I work in theater, not women's studies.
Mm-hmm.
So when I would do mainstream theater events, often the work that was being done was deeply offensive to me, or completely, I didn't see lesbian representation in mainstream theater for the first quarter century of my career. And that was an issue between me and my colleagues. It was huge. It became easy to get that distance you're talking about, because I was very disincentivized from socializing. It was uncomfortable for me. Well, that's interesting that is what you do. So I guess, why don't we jump in here? We're wanting to tell stories, and this is great because that's what I love doing, a case study. So let's start with the education of women and girls as a tool for empowering entire communities.
Oh, this is great. And boy, do I have a great story, too. I have many wonderful stories. First of all, I just want to connect to something we were just talking about. I keep a journal, and aside from the academic writing I might be doing, or writing, mini histories of women's music for different sources and so on, I've been keeping a journal since I was 12. I'm on volume number 173. I write maybe about 3 pages a day. It's not consistent. It adds up to that, though. I do about four 300-page journals a year. And I became aware at a really young age that although I was writing about, getting my period or going to peace marches, that was historically relevant, that what I experienced in my time might be interesting to somebody 100 years from now, because, of course, I was reading Anne Frank's diary and journals by women who'd lived 100 years ago. And I was interested in whether or not I could discipline myself to take notes on the material culture of my own time. Like, occasionally I would just pause when I wanted to write about my day and really put in facts like, what does shampoo cost in my time? What are we watching on TV? What are the issues in the headlines today? And I've tried to document my life as a lesbian feminist activist, as well as record, my personal feelings.
Oh, my gosh, Bonnie, those journals are going to be absolutely priceless.
Well, my handwriting has just gone to hell as I do so much typing now, but I've tried to be clear, decent, not write anything, too mean about anybody and that kind of thing. But I know that when I teach a class, I begin by explaining to my students that one of the reasons we have all these blank spaces about women's lives is very few women in the past had the leisure, the literacy, or the pen, or the privacy to put their lives down.
What that makes me realize is it was really not until the 1970s and honestly till the early 80s, people still thought that rape was this sort of rare event that happened with strangers in dark alleys, and that incest never happened except maybe very, very poor, ignorant people somewhere over there off in the country. Right. And it's astounding when you consider, 1 out of 3 girls before 18. It's like, why weren't we talking to each other?
Well,
how could such an obvious, enormous chunk of our day-to-day lived reality have stayed closeted for so long? And I think it
was so private. And the 3 things I get out on the table on the first day of class is most of women's lives were in the private sphere. History is about what goes on in the public sphere. When women go out into the public sphere, they're judged by their modesty, their sexuality, their appearance, who they're married to, and et cetera. Women trying to describe how they have survived have hidden or burned their diaries, and the record that we have leaves out the, stories, women who were enslaved or couldn't write or et cetera. And then I use textbooks like The Body Project by Joan Jacobs Brumberg. She's a historian who actually researched 100 years of girls' diaries, and she asks the question, so when did girls start talking about the reality of puberty and sexuality and what happened to them that was violation? I know that in the 20th century, we went from movie censorship, which then became TV censorship, and we don't really get consciousness-raising groups until the late 60s, early 70s. Then we get Oprah, Phil Donahue, talk shows, which were very important in revealing to the public what was going on in women's private lives. And that was very important before the Internet and the ability to look up information on sexual assault in your own computer. I know that teaching women's history is so much about the body, the violation of the body, and what's thought of as intimate information, that it's very easy for panicky educators and parents to say there's no way you could bring a women's history or women's studies curriculum into a middle school. Women's lives are not age-appropriate material. So girls don't get women's history because the planet has decided that women's history equals just contraception and abortion. And there's some tepid effort through, Women's History Month to bring a little biographical material into the month of March, and you can look at Sally Ride and Rosa Parks. But there really isn't a lot of support for bringing the tough realities of women's history to young women who are coming of age and really need those stories. And the field of women's history, getting that into the academy and taken seriously and letting scholars get PhDs in that is very recent. And in the United States, a lot of the effort was led by a scholar named Gerda Lerner, who was herself a Holocaust survivor. She, I think, spent her 18th birthday in prison for anti-fascist resistance work, and she built up a scholarly interest in women's history in the U.S. That I'm very proud to say was also sustained by a lot of other Jewish women, many of whom I studied with in my own graduate years. But frankly, you couldn't do a PhD in women's history anywhere in the United States except the State University of New York at Binghamton, where I went, until around 1984. And I went to Binghamton on a teaching assistantship, understanding that while quite a few schools offered an MA in women's history or women's studies, if you wanted to be a professor and get a doctorate, there's one school. And, boy, we all went there. My eccentric gang of classmates, who I still love to this day, were all in this terrific, dynamic women's history program. And we were held to very high standards. But here's the interesting thing. A very high percentage of my classmates were lesbians, but we were given no lesbian history. We were given very good, introduction to Southern women's history, labor history.
Well, that
doesn't
really,
it
doesn't surprise me because I think it's still the Lavender Menace. Anytime women gather together about women's business, whether it's the political like now or it's women athletes, everybody feels that they're doing everyone a favor to make sure nobody assumes this is lesbian or that this will turn people into lesbians.
Exactly. And the irony is, we were, it didn't occur to me, we were all, activists out there in the streets going to various rallies. There was a lot of pro-choice activism. A lot of us were in the peace movement and driving up to the Seneca Falls Women's Peace Camp, getting arrested. We were certainly not afraid to take risks. It just didn't occur to us until appallingly late that we had a right to ask for current scholarship on the history of our own damned identities. I think the first person who insisted on doing a dissertation that looked critically at lesbian lives was Rochella Thorpe, a friend of mine who then did a really dynamic focus on black women's bars in Michigan, and at one point ran for, I think, City Council of Ithaca. But the rest of us sort of divided our time into doing, quote, real history in school and then doing lesbian activism on our own time. And that's when I realized nobody was doing critical research on the women's music movement, which I saw as a fantastic renaissance in my own life. I really feel that I and you, we've all, through women's music and festival culture, lived through a renaissance of culture and music. And I spent every nickel I had going to festivals and concerts and collecting early albums and leaflets and programs and stuff. And I felt at the time this insane disconnect, like I couldn't bring that into my university career and write about it in an academic way that would be taken seriously. I had to do, quote, creative writing about festival culture and just kind of save up until the right moment my urge to do a quote, real book on all of this.
It was, and I think it still remains an incredible flowering of culture. And what I'm thinking of is Monique Wittig's and Sandy Zeig's book, A Dictionary for Lesbian Peoples, where they're sort of looking back and trying to contextualize this huge lesbian movement, and they refer to it as the Golden Age. And I remember the first time I read that, I was in the middle of it, but I thought, yes, it will be passing. It will be passing. There will be a backlash, and we will look back on this and go, oh my God, that was a golden age. That was the golden age of lesbians, of women. And so to me, what you're describing is that you were self-consciously archiving the golden age.
Yeah, absolutely. I collected so much stuff, and it's all in a big dresser. I really didn't plan it this way because it sounds so sex-typed. It's all in a pink dresser right by the front door. And there just happened to be this piece of furniture that my mother had while she was teaching dance to kids, and she used it, you'll love this, to keep glowworm costumes. She did a whole lot of creative dances with stressed-out kids in the D.C. area, and got them to do creative movement, and she would keep the fun dance recital outfits in this dresser, which then passed on to me when my parents retired. And it's exactly the right shape to hold taped interviews that I've done with different musicians and programs and so forth. And I keep all of that practically up against my front door so that if, God forbid, a fire ever broke out, I just grab the top drawer and run. Everything precious, the people I've interviewed who are no longer living, and the early programs from festival culture. I know some of this stuff now is digitized, but all of the time capsule stuff I have right by my escape hatch. And so when I was in grad school and sort of doing all of this as a hobby, let's say, I became aware that while we were all going to festivals and concerts, and that was a social calendar that was year-round, it certainly wasn't reported on in the mainstream, and a lot of people would have had no idea what was going on. And so in a very short period of time, it became almost historical, because the stuff that was going on in the 70s changed very much by the time I finished grad school in 1989. I was able to see how production values had changed. People were starting to record on CDs. There were the beginnings of gay and lesbian civil rights protections. Anyway, I felt very comfortable that I knew what I knew. I had confidence as a historian because I had lived in the subculture I was writing about. And just like anyone else who's representing sort of a minority, you know you have a culture with a rich heritage, and you also know the mainstream is not going to take you seriously because you represent the other. So connecting this to the story I said I was going to tell you, that's a great case history. Here at GW, the person I referred to, Gerda Lerner, a great historian who started the women's history field, she's the author of two textbooks you would love, The Creation of Patriarchy and The Creation of Feminist Consciousness. And her main argument is in every generation, women feel like they're starting from scratch, that they don't know the women who came before them who might have been activists, or they don't know if someone has pursued already the issue that they're angry about right now. We're not told who the previous activists were, and you have to go with no blueprint, which is exhausting, and you also don't benefit from a heritage of all the people who were geniuses in their own time. So I'm teaching this book, trying to make this point with my young students, and in the third row, a girl raises her hand and says, "That's my grandmother." I had Gerda Lerner's granddaughter in my class, and she said, "You know what? The book is actually dedicated to me."
Oh,
so here we had the granddaughter of the author, and I said, "I want you to interview your grandmother as your final paper. I want you to draw a line of the passing down of studying women's history in your own family and how you are this next generation receiving the work that your grandmother laid out." So she went home and did this phenomenal interview, which was a very good paper, and which began as an oral history. I told her to start there and transcribe it. So then I was summoned to have tea, actually a very stiff martini, with Gerda Lerner herself, and she was like, "I understand, you are a dynamic teacher." She's a very imposing person. At any rate, she, I'm sorry to say, recently passed away, but her family told me that my book was on her bedside table when she died. And the last chapter of Women's History for Beginners, I have this story, and I quote from Sophia's paper about her grandmother's life.
Oh, that's
and I just,
full circle.
I feel like here's an example where the lineage of a person who is trying to get people interested in women's history, there's something that brings together all these elements in my life. I feel like a very lucky, magical person in a lot of ways. It hasn't been easy to establish myself in academia. I am not tenured, nor will I ever be. I think most women's studies programs similarly do not offer tenure lines. They're not funded in that way, and you just go from year to year without much promotion. So you have to really love what you do.
I have to say I'm shocked. I knew years ago you were not tenured, and I thought, well, it's coming. And then all these books, and then you being invited to the White House, and I was just like, oh, yeah, I am absolutely stunned. I'm floored that you're not on the tenure
still living
track.
one potato at a time, and, eventually, I'll make more noises about my situation, but the fact of the matter is that it's institutional. There's many women's studies programs that are similar. Now, you have a couple places that are much more funded with a PhD program, et cetera. Like the University of Maryland has a PhD level women's studies program. That's a state university, and they have a very complex program with lots of speakers. They also house the National Women's Studies Association. So it really just depends where you are. But yeah, there's no such thing as a real merit system. And there's real interest in women's studies and women's history. So you can have lots and lots of people, students taking classes. They may not all choose to major, but more and more, this is the success story in this interview, the happy sustainability story is that feminists have succeeded in making women's studies acceptable because it's offered at thousands and thousands of schools and in 40 countries or more. There's no question that it's now normal to take a women's studies class, to be expected to know at least a few facts about when women got the vote, to be openly hostile to learning anything about women is now pretty much a mark of ignorance. And, the guys who take my classes are often, very often, the sons of single moms. They respect women. They also have seen the wage discrimination or whatever that their mom dealt with.
I saw that. Yes, that started. Yeah. I saw that starting about 15 to 18 years ago. Mm-hmm. When I was touring to colleges and universities, I began to notice there'd been a large shift in the attitudes of the young men who would encounter my work. And I agree with you. I believe it was being raised by single moms. And sexism, their mother's struggle became theirs because they were children.
Yeah.
And yes, I totally agree. I think that there's been a huge shift in consciousness, not just around women's studies, but around, it isn't the women's liver, bra burner, eye roller thing anymore. And women are not afraid to say the word feminist. In the 90s, that was a big thing, like, nobody wanted to identify as feminist, which I thought was insane. But, yeah, I agree. There's been a huge shift, and I think that women's studies reflects that shift, but also kind of spearheaded that movement. So, well,
there's two interesting problems which I never planned. So on the one hand, woohoo! Now it's sort of mainstream to take women's studies. But on the other hand, what that means is that not everybody who enrolls in such a class is a feminist or cares about the feminist movement. They're interested in an easy A, or they hear that I'm nice, or whatever it is. So one of the reasons I have all this writing time in my office hours is, I still expect people to come in and say, I want to talk to you about feminism. The reading enraged me. I want to take action, and that does not happen. What I get is people who come in and go, I can't believe I got a B+. I am an A student. So it's a very competitive world out there, and at a private university, I have a lot of students who are ambitious, and their main concern, it could be any subject. I mean, I'm teaching women's history, but it could be zoology or economics or French. The interest is the A. What's the grade going to be? So on the one hand, more people are taking women's studies, but it's just sort of like hurry up and get the A. Then the other thing is more and more people who have never been asked to write about sex and gender are bewildered by the mixed messages that they're getting. Can they do well if they've never been invited to write about women's history before, and this is the first time, and what am I looking for? So I get a great deal of nervous questions, and they usually begin with, do you want us to? And I'm like, it's not what I want. You know, I'm asking you, yes, to write a paper, but I'm not going to go paragraph by paragraph to give you the perfect model to get the perfect grade. What do you think? What do you see? So my obvious concern is we have a lot of students who are good test takers, but they panic when they're invited to sort of think for themselves or to work on their own. They're used to, you know, a situation where they can take standardized tests several times till they get the perfect score. The idea of really tackling a difficult research topic that's very painful, like sexual assault or something, there's only a few who are really going to make this their subject matter in a way that brings out the absolute best of original thinking and so on. The best I can do is inform lots and lots and lots of people who are brand new to college that, yes, women have a history. Here are some highlights. Here's how we look at the past. We look at the ways that traditionally women have not supported each other and, you know, owned one another as slaves and abused each other as servants or whatever. So if they're looking just for, you know, the answer is patriarchy, like, yeah, but, you know, you also have to look at how women have been active in keeping one another down. The great payoff for me is I do get, at the end of the semester, dozens of people coming in and saying, oh my gosh, this class changed my life. Or more funny is around Thanksgiving, people will come back from vacation and say, I had an argument at the dinner table with my parents because of our class. I'm like, great, I'm so happy I brought disharmony to your family holiday. But people will go home and they'll really challenge their boyfriend or their family. They'll often come back and take a seconds class. They'll be interested. And I get lots of international students who are quick to point out they just don't have access to a feminist theory class at home, so they want to enjoy it while they're here if they're just at the university for 1 year. And I have people from all over the world. Right now I have students from Bahrain, Bangladesh, Jamaica, mentally rummaging around the room, quite a few South Asian students, many from the Middle East, and all wonderful.
Well, I'm sure it's a revelation. Hello?
Some of it is, I think, I'm embarrassed to say American focused, and I'll usually apologize if I stop being global and start just talking about, you know, 70s feminism in the East Coast or whatever. The predicament, of course, is now we're really directed to look at global conflict and through a gender lens and so forth. Everybody's talking about the drama this week of ISIS as a terrorist group that's particularly horrible to women. But in response to their action in the burning of this pilot, we see a country like Jordan hanging a female prisoner. And in the past, you would not have seen women brought into capital punishment except for sexual offenses. I don't know if this is progress. And so a lot of the final papers my students do tend to be on global issues. They will look critically at a phenomenon like women as terrorists or female circumcision and female genital mutilation. So as much as my personal interest is how the renaissance of lesbian culture played out in the 70s, 80s, 90s now, I'm now working in a much more global economy of information, and I have to be really ahead of the students in what are the latest issues in every country of the world. It's exhausting, but it's also given me opportunities to travel like you have and speak overseas. And one of the most moving experiences for me was being an instructor on Semester at Sea, which is a ship that takes about 400 or 500 college students around the world. So I was able to teach global feminism in that program twice, in 1993 and 2004, and we went to 12 different countries while offering a regular kind of floating college campus. And I took my women's studies classes to a feminist bookstore in Bangalore, India, and to a women's shelter in Russia, and to the Chinese opera school in Taiwan, which was very moving because we saw little girls being trained to walk as if they had bound feet. They were being rehearsing historical theater. You would have loved this, you know, and they put on these little wooden stilts that gave them a particular gait that mimicked what women of another time really would have experienced. So Semester at Sea was like a mini immersion in just about every curveball women of the world have been thrown. At a certain point, when I returned as a veteran professor, I taught for them again 10 years later, and we were able at that time to go to Cuba, unlike most Americans. And I was able to meet with Fidel Castro, and he greeted our ship, and I actually debated feminism with him in Spanish. That is never going to happen again. And his sort of opening line was, "Oh, so you teach women's studies. You know, if women ran the world, there would be no war." And I said, you know, that's a really interesting theory, but I don't think every female leader has the maternal instinct you believe in. And I started naming militaristic women leaders. It's unreal, you know, and we're doing all this while we're drinking mojitos, and I'm sweating and thinking no one is going to believe this is happening. And those experiences have sort of kept me involved with, well, what's going on with women's studies programs in other nations. And occasionally I've been able to give talks in places that really are way ahead of the U.S. in terms of their feminism. Iceland is a great example. They have an openly lesbian prime minister. They have a government building that's just for women. They have a national magazine. They had a women's strike where all the women refused to cook for the men for one day. They don't even really have a women's prison, and so forth and so on. So I went there and gave a talk, and I tried to say a few words in Icelandic, which is very beautiful and challenging. And the people who attended that evening included everybody from one of the first national female ministers to these great crusty babes who were translating the Vagina Monologues into Icelandic. And they were very concerned about the show being represented correctly in traditional Icelandic language, but without pornographically altering the meaning of the title. It was just amazing, and these high-level discussions were going on. I just felt like I was in heaven, you know, and plus there was really good coffee, geysers, midnight sun, and whales.
Yeah, you're sort of an ambassador for the second wave.
Well, you know, I feel like, I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like I want to say something important about that. I am really hyper aware of my privilege. I am the daughter of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father who's a surfer guy. I look very much like an all-American girl. I don't intimidate people. People don't think I'm gay. They don't think I'm Jewish, blah, 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 which makes me a kind of stealth radical, because I can I can be a diplomat from Dykeland. That's something I've often said, in ways that are not threatening to people, because whatever biases people carry around with them, I don't appear to trigger their archetype. And at an early age, I realized that if I was cheerful and friendly, I was able to get close to a lot of people whose minds I could then change. And for whatever reason, the stereotype of a scary feminist was not what people thought of when they met me. So in busting whatever unfair stereotype people have, I've attracted people to my classes or whatever. And it would be very, very different if I had gone through life, obviously, as, a woman of color or looking different or whatever it was that made people less likely to hear or invite what I had to say. So I am, honestly, in my journal, I spend much more time writing about what is the right thing to do, what is the moral obligation, how should I function in the world, how much of my energy should I give away, when should I ever ask for money, for instance, for what I do, how can I be more, how can I do good, and what kind of friendly weapons in my arsenal will make that happen. And I know that I owe a great deal to the example of my parents, who took me out on peace marches when I was 5 and took all kinds of risks for the greater good. But I know that other women who have had all kinds of harassment or who have been treated really brutally in academic settings, their experience would be very different from mine. So I'm just an example of my own life, if you will. And I often overhear things people say that are dismissive of feminism or really homophobic or anti-Semitic or whatever, because they feel they can say those things in front of me. So I'm a very good witness to the lingering baloney out there, and I also am cautious when I'm in a situation that doesn't feel safe to talk about what I really do, often if I'm taking a cab or something and the driver says, so what do you do? Boy, if I say, well, I teach women's history, I'm in for a really uncomfortable time. And if I don't want to have that uncomfortable time, I'll just say, I teach American history. And then I hate myself for lying. But I think we have to protect ourselves, because it's not always well received. And I had a father really test me the other night in a way that was just, so annoying. You saw it on my Facebook page. This guy was like, oh, you teach women's history? How come there's no men's history?
But the thing is, Bonnie, you shared that. You shared that on the Internet, and I know it was draining, and you're thinking, oh, my God, I'll be dead, in 10 minutes if I keep letting idiots like this drain me dry. But I felt like you turned it into a teaching moment on the Internet, and I thought it sparked a lot of interesting conversation. And so sometimes I think these stands that we take, I'm thinking of Jamie Anderson at the border crossings repeatedly correcting them, and, about my husband. She says, no, my wife, and they always pull her out and make her go through.
That's so cool.
And nobody's witnessing that. It's like a little one-woman protest but she put it in her book, and it comes to my mind repeatedly. It was like, I said when I reviewed the book, I said, that's the cut. That's the big girls club. When you do it just because. Oh,
I love that phrase, the big girls club. All I've ever wanted is to be in with the big girls who are the people who were my role models. The fact that I'm friends with so many of my role models, and that could include you or, festival producers and artists or, authors and poets and et cetera. It's just the people who really care about the culture. I want to be in on those conversations. And
I don't want to cut you off, but I'm conscious of time, and I got a bunch more questions to go.
Okay, sorry, go on. Please ask.
Did you get your 3 case studies out?
My 3 case studies?
Let's see. There's one about education of women and girls, and then importance of mainstreaming women's history, and then
I would say attracting students who might not have taken women's history a generation ago are now there in huge numbers, but we need to make them stick with it intellectually and not just be there for the A. So to sustain women's history, we really need to get a next generation of historians, and we need people to be aware that their own experience is worth archiving and narrating. And you're quite right about teachable moments, too.
Well, this is a great segue into the fact that you just recently wrote an article on the women's music movement for the Journal of Gender, Education, Music, and Society. Can you share with us something about that article?
You bet. I wanted very much to talk about how we're in a difficult moment where the women's music movement is still ongoing, and it's seen as too recent to be regarded as historical, and yet at the same time some of our elders are starting to pass, including Kay Gardner, Maxine Feldman, Jenny Clemens, Therese Adele, and younger women are not familiar with their names. They turn to commercially successful artists like the Indigo Girls or whomever. So I wanted to depict a moment of collaboration between Kay Gardner and Ubaka Hill, and I had attended a recording session a long time ago in Woodstock, New York, and I recreated that recording session, which involved all kinds of women in the drum song orchestra. Kay as producer, Karen Kane mixing sound. It was all these women who had broken through. That Karen had been one of the first women to become a recording engineer, and Ubaka was carrying on the tradition from Edwina Lee Tyler that drumming was a woman's right. And then here was Kay, who had performed on Alex Dobkin's first lesbian album, Lavender Jane Loves Women, who was now producing other women, and also talking about the idea of a female sound in music. That's part of Kay Gardner's book. And I wrote connecting just a snapshot of a moment to the larger picture, sort of pleading with people to not forget these moments of collaboration. And I loved that particular recording session because the women in charge, were African American, lesbian, Jewish. I mean, it was like it was just great. And what we had was also the popularizing of something new at the time, bringing the idea of a drumming orchestra to the Michigan Festival, and Ubaka Hill was very successful and beloved there. So that article was something I had been trying to publish for quite a while, and one of the things that I've been doing is just trying to get everything I've ever written out there. Part of it feels like I want it out of my body, but also it's like now or never. I don't want Women's Music Festival history to get lost. I want people to know the names of, these women. I worry that although it's great that now we have choices of many archives, that people's collections are going to kind of scatter to quite a few different places, and we're seeing the aging of a culture, which is just it's going to happen. But women are turning more and more to, as Jamie Anderson's wrote a memoir, and even I've written, kind of a lot of memoir type stuff, although I'm just about 53. Trying to get the stories down and passing them along is really tricky in our time because publishing has completely changed. You can self-publish, but it's just not everyone is reading the same stuff. And I think we all miss the early days of feminist bookstores where, there were like 100 main books that everybody was reading. And you talked about Pastor, you talked about Monique.
Inevitable. I think it was inevitable that, yes, I remember I'd go to people's homes all over the country, and everybody had, Audre Lorde, and they had Audrey and Rich.
Yesterday's Lessons by Sharon Isabel, and Judy Braun, and so on. And, I can see, I have them all on my shelf at home, and it's delightful that it's become far more diverse and democratic and so on. I just feel that the sense of a culture that was shared has also changed. One of the hardest things to do, and here we're back to the issue of sustainability, it's really hard to describe to my students the kind of treasure hunt people like you and I used to have to do if you wanted a simple piece of information. When there's no internet, no Wikipedia, no computer, you had to, drive to another state and go to a library.
I had files of photocopies. I would photocopy whole books. It was ridiculous.
We would break the law of copyright to Xerox a beloved book that couldn't leave a library. And, of course, if you didn't have the right academic ID, you couldn't even get in to that library. I had to go through 4 or 5 different states and 2 or 3 academic libraries until I finally found one encyclopedia article that confirmed that Louise Fitzhugh was a lesbian, the author of Harriet the Spy. I wanted to know that. I wanted that confirmed. I had to go
we all knew it. We all knew it.
But, it's like I had to go to Carnegie Mellon and all these places. So anyway, conveying to my students, okay, before you could download all the information you want at the touch of a button, how did we do it? And what I really want people to know is the many volunteer hours and clever, creative, intervening ways that women shared to spread exciting information.
Well, that was one of the reasons that, for me, we didn't have money. If you went to a lesbian gathering, you could tell all the vehicles were 10 years older,
exactly.
20 years old. But and usually 2 or 3 broken down in the parking lot with people working on them at the time. But we, to have the funding for film was not even on the radar. To a certain extent, that's still true today. But I felt like we were in a state where I wanted to see lesbians have a flowering of live theater because we could afford that. Anybody who could, if you could put together a softball team or a women's chorus, you could put a play on. And I felt like this is an oral form of transmitting culture. We can do this. We don't need to upload our lesbian history from these very distorted images coming out of Hollywood. And then to that end, I wrote a book, Take Stage, How to Direct and Produce a Lesbian Play, because I realized it was such a hostile art form for lesbians that we weren't even in community theaters, much less academic training. And I just was always disappointed, and I still am, that did not happen. And there's fewer lesbian theaters today than there were 30 years ago. But I agree, it was that cultural transmission, and I want to use that to segue into, when I think of a model of sustainability, I think of the Michigan Women's Music Festival because of the longevity, but also, and until recently, it was off the grid. Your cell phones wouldn't work. Your computers wouldn't work. So it was like you traveled back in time to the 1980s when you went there in terms of tech. And it was a village that you could walk through of thousands of women. The cultural transmission that went on in that village, to me, that's how we do it. It doesn't get lost or stolen. And then the festival itself has enormous amounts of traditions, and some of them are funny and cute, and some of them are just ways of doing things. And it was the first lesbian gathering I had been at where I felt that if some woman was struggling with drugs or alcohol or acting out in some way, that it would be dealt with immediately. Firmly, that these protocols were in place. It wasn't like women struggling about, now, how much of a sister do I need to be right now, and how patriarchal is it to call the police? Everything had been figured out decades ago because of that cultural transmission. You felt this enormous collective wisdom there.
And sustained with creative furniture, measurements, what we would now call, ergonomic, sensibility, so that people understood how you got a rain flap over a stage or the angle of a lighting booth, and all of that had been blueprinted by genius techies. I don't have to go on here about how I love techies and how many techies I've dated, but anyhow, just the respect that I have for the initial generation that, wanting not to depend on men, learned or brought in women who knew things like plumbing and sound and so forth. But I think also what is a great perpetual challenge at Michigan and other festivals I've gone to over 30 years is, we're so in awe of women who become electricians and plumbers, and we often fall into the trap of taking for granted the women who do the food and the child care. And boy, the women who do the food and the child care are very aware of that pattern that we privilege carpenters, or we see the conventionally male jobs still as ranked highest, and having to undo certain aspects of how you privilege butch over femme, or however defined. Those are the best conversations, because they make people look at what do we value and how have we been trained to negotiate with a working woman based on what her skill is. And just, managing an area, the kind of things I do in a day include everything from, hammering and drilling to paperwork and making coffee for people. I mean, it's the whole gamut. So I think critically, while I'm doing tasks, about the meaning of the tasks and so forth. But in terms of passing traditions along, absolutely. And that's something that is so comforting. It's really comforting to people that there are parades at certain times, or that the audience responds. And the other thing that's a very conscious aspect at Michigan in particular is traditional women's arts are paid heed. The quilt is a central feature, as well as, some of the other things. There have been many artworks displayed around the woods. We have made living in the woods less scary for 3 generations of women and girls, which is no small thing, not just because of very real fear of the dark and the stranger, but also returning to the environment as a friend, making friends with the location. And, of course, many people are ready to speak satirically that, well, this proves lesbian feminists are tree huggers. And, I'm a proud tree hugger. I have a particular tree I love. And my only, unfulfilled fantasy really at this stage in life is I've always wanted a treehouse writing studio, and maybe someday I'll construct one gently around some tree. But I think that having a sense of, well, a term that's often used in worker meetings at Michigan, that we're all land stewards. We are all accountable for sustaining
you feel
this
it in the land. I have never seen, and I've only been going 12 years, I think, but I've never seen anybody litter on the land. I can't even imagine it. I can't even. Well, if she did, first off, 6 women would talk to her about it, and 12 women would die for whatever it was she dropped on the ground. Yeah. But I want to, again, I'm conscious of time, and I have something here about in 2007 you visited the Temple of Diana in Turkey.
Oh,
and
my
I wanted to
God,
ask you, it seems like, because we are in the home stretch here, I've got we just have about 7 more minutes or so. So I just wanted to ask you what your experience at the temple was, and what remains of the 7th wonder of the ancient world.
Oh, unbelievable. Well, I have been a proud staff person on Olivia Cruises 4 or 5 times. I'm going to work with them again this summer. This was a trip to Kushadasi and the temple at Ephesus. In returning to this location, first of all, there's an amphitheater there that's renowned for its perfect acoustics. And Chris Williamson went and walked into the middle of that space and sang a lullaby, and every woman's hair stood on end. It was just unbelievable. Nobody asked her to do this. Nobody knew she was going to do this. But that was the most restoring, regenerating act of that entire trip. It brought women's history, women's music, sound, and it reclaimed a space that's notorious for, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, which is the famous wives be subject to your husbands. Those words were spoken in that space as Christianity made a historic defeat of goddess culture. So bringing back this tour group of dusty, crusty lesbians into that space and then having this lullaby that blasted through space. Woohoo! I mean, it was incredible. And I felt so fortunate to just be in that part of the world as, somebody who had read Sappho and who was at least sort of familiar with some of what I was seeing. There were so many women who were thrilled to the point they just couldn't stop talking. And so many of my memories of working with Olivia is being on a bus and just being overwhelmed and falling asleep and somebody tapping me on the shoulder and going, no, I want to ask more about Diana. So the women who are really interested in lesbian culture are really interested in lesbian culture. Everybody wants to know, what are the origins of female power? How have we lost that goddess worship practice? What is it like to have even a glimmer of it? It just shoots energy through the body. I'm excited to talk about it even now.
Well, and this is kind of a good place to sort of try to close off because
okay.
I guess I just heard a fellow speaking on NPR today. He was talking about his sons, and he was saying by the time they're 65, there's a 49% chance the world won't be worth living in, and a 51% chance that it will. And he was talking about the gross inequities socially and politically, as well as the environmental devastation, two different streams of it. And I was listening, and I guess in a certain way it resonates with some of what I see going on. So I want to ask you this about sustainability. Are you hopeful for the future? And if you are, yes. Why?
I am. I have to be. Even if intellectually I'm aware of how gravely the planet is threatened, my entire life has been about preserving a series of journals and artifacts for future generations to study. So I have to believe that life will go on and that I'm serving a valuable purpose. And when I check in with those thoughts, I realize that I'm heavily invested in the future because I want my time to be a worthy past for some other dyke in the future to study. But I believe that we're going to see changes that will increasingly make someone like me uncomfortable as a very 20th century person who likes to write with a fountain pen and so forth. More and more information is going to be us tapping on glass and not writing by hand. And I think how knowledge is preserved will look so different. I can't really imagine it. I
feel that way with the loss of letters. Do you know what I mean? I don't write letters anymore, and my emails, honestly, with rare exception, would be worthless. Nothing like
I've saved all of yours. I have them all tucked into your books.
How sweet. Well, but I just think of, like, if Virginia Woolf had been on a computer, what we would have lost.
Right.
You know?
It's not as if I can tell you also about sustainability. I believe that because we have improved some practices in healthcare and women are living better and longer, or we're making some headway with breast cancer and other things, I believe the longevity for women has some hopeful outlook, and what we really have to think about is what are we going to do with the extra time? What are we going to do with the extra energy? What are we going to do with the healthy 70-year-olds? I mean, I have plenty to do, and all I want is 3 or 4 lifetimes. Not a small thing. I just wish I had so much more time, and I'm really conscious of the, clock ticking in terms of me getting older because I have so much I want to do. But I'm going to continue to put my lifetime effort into preserving and archiving and documenting this dynamic culture I've been proud to be part of, and you were very much part of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bond. Well, I feel like we're closing right in on an hour here, so
awesome.
Unless you've got something else, but I think that's a perfect closing, and I think I'm going to turn this back over to Jenny right now.
Well, you're a genius. You are just an amazing artist, and I'll never forget where I was the first time I saw the second coming of Joan of Arc at the East Coast Lesbian Festival. I was so impressed, and I can picture the sort of boathousey theater where it was performed, and Louisa May Incest as well. Life-changing work. It has the pride of place on my shelf. You're right at eye level. I'm actually touring with Louisa May Incest in New England right now. And you're going to be in D.C. in July. Actually, that's not me. That's another theater company that's licensed Joan of Arc. I have retired that particular piece, but they'll be doing it for the Capitol Fringe. Well, anyway, I want to just turn this back over to Jenny. Yes. So, Jenny, are you there?
I am. Thank you. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Bonnie Morris, and thank you, Carolyn Gage. Wonderful, wonderful interview. And you can find out more about Bonnie's work on her website, bonniejmorris.com. And you can also keep up with her speaking engagements on her biography page. And we have Professor Morris's book, Women's History for Beginners, at greenwomanstore.com. Yeah. And you can also sign up for Carolyn's newsletter at carolyngage.com. Carolyn tours in her own shows and is available for lectures and workshops on lesbian culture and history. Thank you again, Dr. Bonnie Morris and Carolyn Gage. And thank you all for listening in. We hope we have informed and inspired you in many ways, and we hope you will try to catch more of the interviews in this series on feminism and sustainability, as well as our other podcast series on issues important to us as women. And please share these interviews with your family and friends. You never know who you may be inspiring. No matter what your description or experience of feminism is, we hope we have heightened your understanding of feminism's important role in all aspects of sustainability, and restored and strengthened your resolve to build alliances for the future. For it is very clear that none of us are really alone. Keep listening, and bye for now.